everyone, and welcome back. I hope you're having a good day so far. In today's episode, it's all about meatballs. And who doesn't love a good meatball? Meatballs are one of my all-time favorite foods, and today we are going to be doing 3 different recipes that includes 4 different meats. So the great thing about meatballs is you can pretty much make a meatball with any ground meat, and so today we're going to have beef, pork, chicken, and turkey. So all different types of meatballs, and we'll be doing 3 different recipes. So the first 2, Swedish meatballs and the chicken parm, are some of my all-time favorite meatballs. I've made these meatballs multiple times in the past. They're always a hit, always super tasty. And then the third meatball recipe that we'll be doing today is a teriyaki turkey meatball. I've done something somewhat similar to this in the past, but this is a new recipe to me, so we'll see how that turns out. So with that, we can dive right into our first recipe, which is our chicken parmesan meatball recipe. And one of my favorite things about this recipe is that, in my opinion, it tastes pretty much exactly like chicken parm, but with a fraction of the work. So there's no, fiddling around with like breading the chicken and cooking the chicken and all of that. The meatball and the sauce really sort of carries all that flavor. So we're gonna start there. And the first step of our recipe is to make our marinara sauce. So we'll start with that. Okay, so the first step for our sauce is just to mash up all of these garlic cloves. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that real quick. And then after we get all these garlic cloves smashed, we'll go over to the stove and start putting our red sauce together. All right, so the next step, I'm just gonna go ahead and turn this burner on, put a little olive oil in the pan, and then we're just gonna cook our garlic until it's fragrant, so about 30 seconds to a minute, and then we're going to add both our crushed tomatoes and our tomato sauce. Okay, so while that olive oil heats up, I'm just gonna go ahead and open our can of both crushed tomatoes and tomato sauce. This recipe calls for both, which is kind of nice because I feel like the crushed tomatoes give it a little bit more texture. That's all set. We also have our spices that we're going to be adding to the sauce. So we have some crushed red pepper flakes, some oregano, and some salt. That feels pretty warm, so I'm gonna go ahead and add that garlic. Okay, so we're just gonna cook that for about 30 to 60 seconds or until fragrant. Okay, it's been about 30 seconds. The garlic is definitely starting to get fragrant. So now I'm gonna go ahead and add my tomato sauce and tomato paste. And now just adding in those spices. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and just mix everything together. And we're just gonna bring that up to a boil, and then we're gonna reduce it and let it simmer for about 15 minutes. Okay, so while our tomato sauce is on the stove coming together, just simmering right now, I'm gonna go ahead and start making the actual meatballs themselves. So I've prepped most of the ingredients already that we'll need to add. So we just need some spices, which is garlic powder, salt, oregano, black pepper, this egg, Ritz crackers, and Parmesan cheese, and then the ground chicken. So this recipe is like a little different than a lot of meatball recipes. Instead of using breadcrumbs, it uses Ritz crackers. Honestly, not sure I can taste the difference, but we'll just go ahead and follow the recipe on this one. I'm sure if you only had some breadcrumbs, those would work just fine in a pinch. So we're gonna go ahead and crush these up. We just need 22 Ritz crackers. And you guys can't see it, but I have my trusty assistant who's always close by, just in case something happens to spill on the floor. All right, so then we'll just go ahead and combine everything in our bowl. Parmesan, egg, spices, Ritz crackers, and then I'm just gonna go ahead and mix these all together. Okay, so now that that's all mixed together, I'm gonna go ahead and add the ground chicken. Okay, that's the first pound. That's the second pound. Now I'm just gonna mix it all together by hand. And with meatballs, you wanna make sure everything is well or uniformly mixed, but you wanna make sure you don't over mix it as well. I try to do a folding technique. I'm not sure if there's actually a better way out there, but if anyone knows or has a good way to mix meatballs, let me know. Whew. Fingers get kind of cold because the meat is chili. But I think we're getting close here to being fairly uniformly mixed. And I like my other metal bowls a little bit better because my other metal bowls have a little bit of rubber on the bottom, so that helps keep them stable on the countertop. All right, I think that's perfect timing. If you can hear that, the timer for the sauce is going off, so I'm just gonna go over and check that real quick, and then we'll make the meatballs. This definitely has reduced down a bit. It's been going for about 12 minutes or so. The recipe says that you should let it simmer for about 10 to 15. It looks like it's thickened a little bit, but so I think we're all set there. I'm just gonna turn the heat off and let that cool. Okay, so our sauce is done simmering, and so the next step is to assemble the meatballs. The recipe calls for, I think the recipe says it will make 20 meatballs, but I kind of like a little bit of bigger meatballs for this recipe, and I'm trying to put them all in the same dish. So I'm just going to weigh my meatballs to be about 100 grams each. You can make your meatballs whatever size. I always just temp them at the end of cooking just to make sure that they're cooked all the way through. I'm just going to go ahead and get that rolling. So as you can see, these are some hefty meatballs, but it means you have fewer meatballs to roll up then. Fuji, did you come to help Mama? Fuji, did you come to assist? You trying to see if there's anything on the floor for you to eat? Yeah, do those smell good? Those smell good. So the next step is I just pour the sauce, and I just like to make sure that they're at least somewhat covered, just to help make sure they don't get dry out or too crispy on the top. Okay, so we have our sauce in, and then the next step is I'm going to sprinkle our mozzarella cheese over the top. And it's already starting to smell a lot like chicken parmesan. I can smell that marinara. I can smell the parmesan a little bit, the meatballs. It just that characteristic smell. That looks fairly even. So then we're just going to pop this in the oven for about 40 minutes at 350 degrees. And like I said, I always just make sure to temp the meatballs to make sure they're at the right temperature before I'm done cooking. And that way I don't have to worry too much. Like, are these meatballs same size as the recipe? Are they too big? Are they too small? Just that I know that they are cooked all the way through. All right, so the last step of the recipe is to add some panko breadcrumbs that we've toasted in the microwave, as well as some Parmesan cheese on top of the meatballs. And this just gives it that nice crunch that you know and love for chicken Parmesan.
Okay, Riley from the future here. Unfortunately, the audio didn't get recorded, but we're moving on to the second recipe, which is our Swedish meatballs. And the first step in this recipe is to chop up the onions and the garlic And you want to make the onions really fine because these are going in meatballs, so you don't want them to be big chunks. But then once the onion and the garlic are all chopped up, then you will put them in a pan and cook them until they're soft. And this is really the first step because you want to make sure they have at least 5 minutes to cool before you add them into everything else like I'm doing here. So after those are cooked up, the next thing you do is assemble the meatball mixture. So adding the panko, parmesan, spices, which include oregano, allspice, nutmeg, and pepper, along with salt. And then after those are added, I add the whisked eggs to the bowl along with that cooled onion and garlic mixture. And once those are all well combined, then I add the ground pork and ground beef that we're using, and then mix those with my hands so that they're well combined. You don't want to over mix it so it gets tough, but you do want to make sure that it is well mixed. And then once that's all put together, you can just go ahead and start scooping the meatballs onto the baking sheet.
All right, so I had to take a little break to take care of some things real quick, but we're just picking back up. So I just took the meat for the meatballs out of the refrigerator. So we just mixed in everything, and you can see it looks like a nice uniform consistency. So now I'm gonna go ahead and make the meatballs. And what I like to do for the meatballs is I just like to use a cookie baller because it's just a really quick and easy way to make your meatballs be about the same size, and it's much faster than just doing it by hand. The one thing I will say about using the cookie baller is that after I'm done scooping, I usually come through and just round out the balls a little bit so they're a more uniform shape. But this kind of gives a good overall uniformity to their size, so they all cook at about the same pace. The cookie baller that I'm using is a size 40. If you like bigger meatballs, you can use a bigger baller. If you like smaller ones, you can use a smaller one. It's kind of up to you and what your preference is for how big the meatballs are. And depending on your size, you might just need to vary the cook time a little bit, but you can always just check to see if they're done using a meat thermometer and sticking that into a couple just to check the internal temperature. Okay, so that's the first sheet. I'm gonna do my second sheet here. And then after I get these on the cookie sheet, I'm gonna turn my oven on, and then I'm gonna go through and make them nice and round. One of the things I like about meatball recipes is in general how relatively easy they are and how tasty they are. And it's a really easy way to get in some high protein. And this upcoming week, I'm running my first ultra marathon. And so that's one thing I've been really focusing on while I've been training. It's just trying to get enough protein because I realized that I generally don't eat that much. And so, especially with training how much I have been, it's good to get enough protein. All right, so we still have some left, but we'll just do that in a second wave since we are making a double batch. But I'm just gonna go ahead and turn on the oven and then round these out a little bit. Okay, so now while the oven preheats, I'm just gonna go through and don't have to do anything too extensive. I just like making them a little bit more spherical since they don't always come out that spherical. Did end up being able to find some smaller gloves, so that will make this slightly easier. Okay. One of the other things that I like about meal prepping, especially in the summer, is that there's so many things to do. Now that all the snow is melted, you just want to spend time outside, whether that be in the garden or just doing whatever. And so I like meal prepping just in one big fell swoop because then I can make enough to eat for a whole week. We'll still have enough time to do all the things I want to do either during the week after work or on the weekends. So especially in the summer when I'm even busier, I like to do that. All right, so now that that's all set, I think the oven is pretty much preheated, so we're gonna go ahead and put these in the oven and get those cooking, and then we can start on our sauce. Okay, so while our first round of meatballs are cooking, I'm going to start on making the sauce. So I already have measured out my beef broth. I just use a beef bouillon and then use some water because I find the beef bouillon keeps really well. I hate getting like the 4-quart containers of the beef broth because I find that sometimes I use it and then it just sits in the fridge and then I throw it away. So I like using the beef bouillon, so I have that here. And now I'm just gonna go ahead and add the other ingredients that we need for our sauce. So the first one is the parsley. I'm gonna add 2 teaspoons of that. 4 teaspoons of the Worcestershire sauce. And a little extra for good measure. It's one of my favorite ingredients. And then 2 teaspoons of the Dijon mustard. And a hearty 2. I'm gonna mix that all together then. All right, there we go. So now we have most of our sauce ready to go. So I'm gonna move over to the stove because that's where all the sauce will come together. As you can see, this is my very helpful assistant. She is an excellent supervisor, frequently underfoot, but always loving and ready to help clean up spills. Okay, so now we're gonna start on our sauce. The first step of that is melting the butter. So since we're making a double batch, we're using a full stick of butter. And as you can see, my handy assistant is very keyed into butter, which is a very high value food. One of her personal favorites, although not one that she's allowed to eat. And so as you can see, she's moved on to the next step in her algorithm, which is if at first she doesn't get what she wants, the next, and I would say only step, is for her to sit, because she knows if she sits, that she's being a good girl and she usually gets rewarded for that. I'm sorry, honey. Butter is not something that you get to eat. I can start smelling the meatballs. They are starting to smell really good. I can smell the allspice and the nutmeg, and it's making me hungry. So I'm gonna go ahead and add the flour. Okay, so I think the flour is fairly well mixed with the butter, but we're just gonna cook it a while, just a little bit to make sure that it's fully cooked, and then we'll start adding our liquid. I think the instructions say just to cook this for about a minute or 2. All right, and then we're gonna slowly add this broth in little by little. And then I'm gonna keep stirring this constantly until all of this liquid is well incorporated, and then I'm gonna add the next batch. Because for Swedish meatballs, we want a really thick sauce, so that's what this is helping us accomplish. It's almost like a gravy of sorts. And so you just add the next sauce, or the next bit of liquid, once the liquid that you just added is well incorporated. And this last time around, I think I just added a little bit too much liquid. I should have added a little bit less, but I got a little impatient and I was like, I'm just gonna go for it. And so I'm kind of worried that the sauce is gonna turn out a little lumpy now, but I'm sure it will still taste good. Okay, the first round of meatballs just hit 20 minutes, so I'm going to temp them to see how they are, if they're done or if they need a little bit more time. Okay, these are over 200, so they've been in there long enough. We're just looking for a temp of 160, so we should be all set there. So I'm just gonna take the other ones out real quick. The meatballs are out. I'll put the next round of meatballs in a second, but I just wanna finish this sauce real quick. So basically you bring this mixture to a boil and then you reduce it to low to let it simmer. And then the final step of this process is to just temper the sour cream a little bit before you add it. And this is what gives the Swedish meatballs then that nice kind of tangy flavor that you know and love. All right. And then, just so we don't break our sauce when we add in the sour cream, add a little bit of this hot sauce. Okay, you can see it's starting to get a little bit soupy, but I'm just gonna add a little bit more. Really, you can't add too much of the sauce because it's all going back together. It's more just making sure that you're bringing that sour cream up to the same temperature, I think. Or at least that's my understanding of it. Okay, so now we're just gonna finish up our last round of meatballs here. And one thing that I wanted to mention about this recipe is that it does actually call for you making the meatballs in the skillet. And then once the meatballs are done, you just make the sauce directly in the skillet after that. So then you get like the juice from the meatballs. That can add a little bit of flavor to your sauce. But what I find is I much prefer just making the meatballs in the oven. I find it a way faster, less stressful process, especially when I'm doing a double batch, because not all these meatballs will fit in the skillet. And then if you cook it in the skillet, you have to make sure you rotate it so you don't burn it and then cook through. And I just find it's much easier to cook them through when you put them on a cookie sheet and stick them in the oven. And then honestly, the sauce to me always still tastes good regardless of whether I've cooked the meatballs in the pan before or not. So I just like this. I just think this simplifies things a little bit. So I prefer to do it this way, but you could in theory do it either way. Okay, we still have a little bit of sauce, so I'm gonna need to get my second pan ready here. Okay, Fuji, you need to back up, honey. Okay, back up, please. Okay, beep, 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 beep. So our last set of meatballs are cooking. Our first set is done. Our sauce is done. So basically we're all set. One thing that I choose to do is I store the meatballs and the sauce in two separate containers, and then who's ever eating it can decide how much sauce they want. If you want, you could just pour the sauce into this container. Really, no downside of that. I just personally like keeping them separate. So I'm gonna go ahead and get this sauce decanted, and then we should be all set. Okay, so this makes a lot of sauce. I don't quite have a container quite big enough, but I'm going to use this bowl, I think, because then it has a lid and that will fit in the refrigerator well. So I'm going to do my best to decant this without spilling anything, but probably not going to work. Okay, so our final recipe for our meatball marathon is our turkey teriyaki recipe. And I love teriyaki. I've never actually made these meatballs before, so this is a first for me. So I'm kind of curious to see how they turn out. But the first step of this recipe is essentially to cut up the cabbage and the shiitake mushrooms. So we're going to start by doing the cabbage. We need about a cup and a half of the cabbage. And I'm not sure, to be completely honest, the best way of thinking about doing this. This is probably a non-traditional way. But we're supposed to put both the cabbage and the shiitake in the food processor and pulse them further. So it needs to be small enough to go in there. And I need to be able to measure a cup and a half.
I feel like instead of using a whole head of cabbage, you could also probably buy the pre-shredded cabbage too. Some sort of coleslaw mix, that would probably be fine. But okay, that's clearly a little bit more than a cup and a half. That's probably about right. Honestly, it probably doesn't matter too much. So let's see how this goes. I'm going to put the mushrooms in there. Those are still a little wet. And I'm going to put the cabbage. And then it says to pulse 5 times or until chopped into 1/4 inch pieces. The other thing is the recipe calls for 6 ounces of shiitake mushrooms. Where we're at, they only had 5-ounce packages, so I think honestly that's probably fine. And shiitakes are expensive, so you're just gonna keep it at 5. Okay, here we go. Okay, that actually looks pretty good. Okay, I actually think that works surprisingly well. It's kind of doubtful, but you can see the mushroom pieces are a lot smaller now, and they'll even cook down a little bit once we cook them too. So I think that should be hopefully okay. Okay, so I'm just gonna let this cook down for about 5 or 6 minutes here. And there are still some big pieces of the mushrooms, so I'm just gonna cut those up a little bit. But okay, I'm just gonna let that cook. And while that cooks, I'm gonna get some of my other things ready. I'm just seeing how the mushrooms and the cabbage look. I think that looks pretty cooked down, so I'm gonna go ahead and add the garlic and the ginger. And ginger. And I'm just gonna mix these in for about 30 seconds or until fragrant. So next we're starting on the sauce. We're going to start by adding the rice vinegar, a tablespoon of rice vinegar. Oops. Should have done the cornstarch first. A tablespoon of cornstarch. And then we just mix these together to form a slurry. Okay, those are all mixed together. And now we're going to make the rest of the sauce in the stove. So now we're making the rest of the sauce. We're going to start by adding 1/2 cup of mirin, 1/3 cup of water, and 1/4 cup of soy sauce. And usually I try to do this all in like a big measuring cup so I don't get 3 different cups sturdy, but this is all I have. And then 3 tablespoons of sugar. Supposed to bring this to a boil, and then once it comes to a boil, I mix in the cornstarch mixture that we put together earlier. Okay, and then once it's come to a boil, I turn it off the high heat to a medium low. To help it thicken. I'm gonna let that simmer until thickened. It says about 1 minute. And I have my very friendly helper always underfoot this one. Okay, you can see it's definitely getting a little thicker. Get a little bit longer, about like 30 more seconds. And then I'm gonna take that off the heat. And then I'm gonna transfer 3 tablespoons of the sauce into our mushroom mixture that we made earlier. 1, 2, 3. No, they're a little shy, so I'm just gonna mix these together. Okay, so now we're just working our way through the rest of the meatballs. So I'm just gonna cut up some scallions for that.
The recipe called for 4, but these were rather large, so I think these 3 are more than enough. Yeah, you can hear any of that heavy panting. That would be my dog, lecherously looking at these scallions. So now we're going to add the rest of our things to the meatball mixture. So we're going to add our half a cup of panko. We're going to add our scallions. We're going to add our egg and our cilantro. I already had a bunch of cilantro already cut up from recipes earlier this week, so I'm just going to use that. We need sesame oil. Sesame oil is one of my favorites. I just love the way it smells. I feel like it adds such a depth of flavor to whatever you're making. And it also says at this point in the recipe to add the chicken, but and all the other meatball recipes that I ever made usually just mix this mixture together first and then add the chicken, so it's just all well mixed up. There's no salt in this recipe, and I know we put 3 tablespoons of the sauce in here, which has some soy sauce in it, but I feel like that's just not going to cover it, so I just added a little bit of salt. I'll let you know how that goes at the end. Hopefully that will be okay. But all right, so now we're just going to add our turkey. Unfortunately, my keto baller is dirty, so I'm just going to use a tablespoon as a way to estimate these. And again, this recipe, it says there's going to be 40 meatballs, but it's kind of a small meatball. I prefer to just make fewer meatballs and temp them, so that's what I'm going to do.
Hi everyone, Riley from the future here. So I guess I somehow lost the footage, so just wanted to film a little ending to the meatball video. And I just wanted to let everyone know that all 3 meatballs, the Swedish meatballs, the chicken parm, and the teriyaki meatballs, all turned out really well. I would definitely recommend all 3 recipes. All were different in their own right, but equally delicious. So I really hope you enjoyed watching this video, and we'll see you in the next one.